Imagine co-founding a company with your college roommate. You pour everything into it, your time, your energy, your vision. You create something that millions of people will eventually love. And then, right when it's about to explode into a multi-billion-dollar empire, you walk away. 3 years later, that company goes public at $12 billion. 7 years after that, your partners are worth billions. And you? You got 700 million. Now, that sounds like a fortune, right? But here's the twist. If you'd stayed just a few more years, you would have been worth over $2 billion instead. That's not a small difference. That's $1.4 billion you left on the table. $1.4 billion. This isn't a story about greed. This is a story about timing, about burnout, about the invisible pressures that push founders out of their own companies. This is the story of Paul Sciarra, the forgotten co-founder of Pinterest. And most people have never even heard his name. If you're intrigued by the hidden stories behind the companies that shaped our digital world, the stories that never make the headlines hit, that like button and subscribe to the Sleeping Economist. Now, let's dive in. Chapter 1. The Yale Connection. Our story begins at Yale University in the early 2000s. Paul Sciarra and Ben Silbermann were classmates, but they weren't just any students. Both were smart, ambitious, and drawn to the idea of building something meaningful. Sciarra studied political science and had an analytical mind. Silbermann, on the other hand, came from a medical family and was expected to become a doctor, but he had different plans brewing in his mind. After graduation, both ended up working in traditional roles. Silbermann went to Google, one of the most coveted jobs in tech at the time. Sciarra worked at venture capital firm Radius Ventures. By all measures, they had landed safely. They were set up for comfortable, respectable careers. But comfort wasn't what they wanted. In 2008, everything changed. The global financial crisis was beginning to shake the world economy. And yet, in the midst of all this chaos, Silbermann and Sciarra decided to take a leap. They quit their jobs to start their own company. They called it Cold Brew Labs. Their first product was an iPhone app called Tauda, mobile shopping platform designed to help people catalog products they wanted to buy. It was a clever idea, especially for its time. The iPhone had just been released the year before, and mobile shopping was still in its infancy. Tote was essentially a digital catalog. You could browse products from various retailers and save them in collections on your phone. No more ripping pages out of magazines or forgetting what you wanted to buy. It was all right there, organized and accessible. But Tote had a major problem. People weren't buying anything. The app allowed users to save products, but when it came time to actually purchase them, people just didn't follow through. The payment systems weren't streamlined enough. The App Store approval process was painfully slow. Updates took forever. And most critically, users were behaving in a way Sciarra and Silbermann had anticipated. People were using Tote, but not for shopping. They were saving images. They were creating collections of things they liked, not things they intended to buy. They were curating visual inspiration. That's when the light bulb went off. What if the product wasn't about shopping at all? What if it was about collecting ideas? What if it was about inspiration, creativity, and visual discovery? That realization became the foundation for Pinterest. Sciarra and Silbermann brought in a third partner, Evan Sharp, an architect and designer who understood the visual language they needed. Together, they launched Pinterest in March 2010. It wasn't a shopping app anymore. It was a place to pin your interests, your dreams, your hobbies, your aspirations onto virtual boards. It was a digital scrapbook for the internet age. And it was Paul Sciarra's original concept of collecting that made it all possible. Chapter 2. Growing Pains and Explosive Growth. Pinterest launched quietly. In fact, it launched so quietly that almost nobody noticed. In August 2010, 5 months after launch, The site had only 5,000 users. Compared to Facebook and Twitter, which were already massive, Pinterest seemed destined for obscurity. But Silbermann, Sciarra, and Sharp believed in the product. They knew it was different. They knew it filled a gap. The early strategy was scrappy. Silbermann would go to coffee shops in Palo Alto and personally ask people to try the site. He'd walk up to strangers, introduce himself, and show them Pinterest on his laptop. Sciarra focused on operations, fundraising, and making sure the back-end infrastructure could scale if, and it was a big if, the site ever took off. Sharp designed the interface, making sure it was clean, intuitive, and beautiful. And then, slowly, something magical started happening. Women, especially, began flocking to the site. They were planning weddings, decorating homes, finding recipes, curating fashion inspiration. Pinterest was filling a need that no other social network addressed. It wasn't about status updates or 140-character thoughts. It was about dreaming and planning and creating. It was aspirational. By December 2011, Pinterest had 11 million users. In just over a year, the site had exploded. It was named one of Time magazine's 50 best websites in 2011. Traffic was soaring. Investors were finally paying attention. Andreessen Horowitz, one of Silicon Valley's most prestigious venture capital firms, led a $27 million funding round in late 2011, valuing Pinterest at $200 million. This should have been the moment of triumph for Sciarra. This was his idea, his company, his vision coming to life. But something else was happening behind the scenes. With rapid growth came intense pressure. The company needed to scale fast. They needed to hire engineers, designers, customer support staff. They needed to build infrastructure that could handle millions of daily users. They needed to figure out a business model. How would Pinterest make money? And they needed strong, decisive leadership. That's where things got complicated. Officially, Sciarra was listed as president and CEO in early regulatory documents. But in practice, Silbermann had started taking over many of the CEO responsibilities. Silbermann was the face of Pinterest. He was the one doing interviews, pitching investors, and setting the product vision. Sciarra, while still deeply involved, was operating more behind the scenes. There's no evidence of a dramatic blow-up or a betrayal, but sources close to the company at the time reported that Sciarra was struggling. The pressure was immense. Pinterest had gone from a side project to a company with millions of users and sky-high expectations, all in the span of months. One source described Sciarra at a dinner event in late 2011 as visibly anxious, even confrontational. He reportedly took a month off in late 2011 to deal with personal issues. The specifics were never disclosed, but it was clear something was wrong. Chapter 3: The Departure. In April 2012, just as Pinterest was entering its explosive growth phase, Paul Sciarra made a stunning announcement. He was leaving Pinterest. Not leaving the board, he'd stay on as an advisor, but leaving his day-to-day role at the company. Ben Silbermann would officially become the sole CEO. The announcement came via a blog post that Sciarra wrote himself. It was gracious, even warm. He praised Silbermann and Sharp. He said it was the right time for him to step back and that he was proud of what they'd built. He mentioned wanting to explore new opportunities. The tone was carefully calibrated. No drama, no finger-pointing, no burned bridges. But behind the scenes, people were asking questions. Why now? Why leave right when the company was about to take off? Pinterest was valued at $200 million and growing fast. Anyone in the startup world knew what was coming next. More funding rounds, more growth, and eventually an IPO. Leaving now meant leaving billions on the table. Industry insiders speculated. Some said Sciarra wanted to remain CEO, but recognized that Silbermann was the better fit. Others pointed to health issues or personal struggles Sciarra had reportedly dealt with. Significant anxiety as the company scaled. There were whispers about investor pressure. Venture capitalists had poured millions into Pinterest, and they wanted the strongest possible leadership. Silbermann, with his product vision and public presence, was the obvious choice. Whatever the real reason, Sciarra was out. He still owned a significant stake in the company, reportedly around 8%, but he was no longer building Pinterest. He joined Andreessen Horowitz, the same venture capital firm that had invested heavily in Pinterest, as an entrepreneur in residence. It was a soft landing, a prestigious role, but it wasn't the same as being a co-founder of a rocket ship company. The departure was described by multiple sources as amicable and mutual. One investor source said, "Whatever Paul has agreed to do, he is doing it willingly. He has lots of shareholder rights." But amicable doesn't mean easy. Sciarra had co-founded Pinterest. He'd been there from the Cold Brew Labs days, from the failed Tote Puppet, from the early brainstorming sessions about what Pinterest could become. And now he was walking away, right before the biggest chapter began. It's important to pause here and recognize what Sciarra did. He held on to his equity. He didn't sell out. He believed in the company's future, even if he couldn't be part of building it anymore. That decision to stay invested would define his financial legacy. But it also meant watching from the sidelines as his former partners became billionaires while he became wealthy, yes, but not a billionaire. Not quite. Chapter 4. Missing the IPO Windfall. After Sciarra left, Pinterest continued its meteoric rise. In 2013, the company raised $200 million at a valuation of $2.5 billion. By 2015, that valuation had jumped to $11 billion. Pinterest was now a household name, a platform with over 100 million active users. It was no longer a quirky startup, it was a tech giant. Silbermann and Sharp continued to lead. They built out advertising products, allowing brands to promote their content on Pinterest. They expanded internationally. They hired hundreds of employees. They refined the product, making it faster, more personalized, more addictive. And through it all, Paul Sciarra's name faded from the narrative. Articles about Pinterest rarely mentioned him. When they did, it was a footnote. Paul Sciarra, who left the company in 2012. Then came April 2019. Pinterest filed for its initial public offering. The company priced its shares at $19, valuing Pinterest at roughly $10 billion on day one. By the end of the first day of trading, the stock surged, and Pinterest's valuation climbed to nearly $13 billion. Investors, employees with stock options, and the founders all watched their net worths explode. Ben Silbermann, the CEO, held about 51.6 million shares after the IPO. At the IPO price, his stake was worth nearly $1 billion. With Pinterest stock climbing, Silbermann's wealth soared past the billion-dollar mark. He was officially a billionaire. Evan Sharp, the chief creative officer, held about 11.4 million shares. His stake was worth over $800 million at the IPO price. Not quite a billionaire, but incredibly close. And Paul Sciarra? He still held approximately 8% of the company, about 7.2 million shares. At the IPO price of $19, his stake was worth roughly $720 million. By some calculations, when Pinterest stock surged on opening day, his stake briefly touched $800 million. 700 million, 800 million. These are life-changing, generational wealth numbers. But here's the brutal reality. If Sciarra had stayed with Pinterest just a few more years, his stake would have been significantly larger. Founders who stick around through growth phases often retain more equity through subsequent funding rounds. They get performance-based stock grants. They're rewarded for staying. Estimates vary, but if Sciarra had remained actively involved through the IPO, his equity stake could have been worth well over $2 billion instead of $700 million. That's a difference of more than $1.4 billion. $1.4 billion gone, not because he sold out, not because he made a bad bet, but because he left early, because he couldn't handle the pressure, because life intervened. Chapter 5. Life after Pinterest. So what did Paul Sciarra do after leaving Pinterest? Did he fade into obscurity, nursing his wounds and counting his millions? Not exactly. In fact, Sciarra found a new mission, one that had nothing to do with social media or digital scrapbooking. Shortly after joining Andreessen Horowitz as an entrepreneur in residence in 2012, Sciarra discovered a small startup called Joby Aviation. Joby wasn't building an app or a website. They were building electric-powered aircraft specifically, vertical takeoff and landing air taxis designed to revolutionize urban transportation. Imagine skipping traffic entirely by flying over it in a quiet, emission-free aircraft. That was Joby's vision. Sciarra was captivated. He made Joby Aviation his first outside investment. And in 2014, just 2 years after leaving Pinterest, Sciarra became Joby's executive chairman. He threw himself into the company, focusing on product development, fundraising, and building the organization. It was a complete pivot from social media to aerospace, but it gave Sciarra something Pinterest couldn't anymore: purpose and control. Joby Aviation has since raised over $130 million from major investors, including Toyota AI Ventures, JetBlue Technology Ventures, and Intel Capital. The company went public in August 2021 through a SPAC merger. Sciarra holds a 10% stake in Joby, which, depending on the stock's performance, is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He's built something meaningful again. But here's the question that haunts every early exit founder. Was it worth it? Sciarra is wealthy, far wealthier than 99.9% of people will ever be. He found a new company he believes in. He's making an impact in the emerging field of electric aviation. By any objective measure, he's successful. And yet, the Pinterest story is always there. In every article about Sciarra, there's a mention of Pinterest. In every profile of Joby Aviation, there's a line about their executive chairman being the forgotten Pinterest co-founder. It's a shadow that follows him. What if that never quite goes away? In interviews, Sciarra has been diplomatic. He told Forbes in 2014, Ben was the guy to take the company into its next phase, and he's doing an excellent job. He's praised Silbermann publicly. He's never shown bitterness. But one has to wonder, does he ever look at Pinterest's market cap today, valued at over $17 billion, and calculate what his stake would be worth if he'd stayed? Does he think about the difference between 700 million and 2 billion? We can't know what's in his mind. But we do know this. Sciarra held on to his Pinterest equity. He didn't cash out in 2012 when he left. He believed in the company's future. That decision alone netted him hundreds of millions of dollars. In that sense, he won. But in the startup world, winning isn't always enough. Sometimes it's about winning big. Chapter 6. What we can learn. So what do we learn from Paul Sciarra's story? Is this a cautionary tale about leaving too early? A reminder that mental health matters more than money? Or is it simply a story about the random, unpredictable nature of success? The answer is all of the above. First, let's talk about timing. In the startup world, timing is everything. If you're a founder, the decisions you make in those critical early years, when to raise money, when to hire, when to scale, can determine whether you build a billion-dollar company or flame out. But there's another timing decision that's often overlooked: when to leave. Sciarra left in 2012, right before Pinterest's explosive growth. If he'd stayed just 2 more years, he would have ridden the wave through multiple funding rounds and likely retained a much larger stake. Second, let's talk about mental health. The startup world glorifies hustle, sleepless nights, and grinding through pain. But what happens when the pressure breaks you? Sciarra's story suggests that even co-founders of billion-dollar companies aren't immune to burnout. The anxiety, the stress, the weight of expectations, it's real and it's crushing. And when you're in that state, the rational choice might be to step away, even if it costs you $1 billion. Third, let's talk about equity and control. One of the most important decisions any founder makes is how much equity to retain. Sciarra held on to his 8% stake. He didn't sell when he left. That decision made him $700 million richer 7 years later. But here's the lesson. Equity is only valuable if the company succeeds. Sciarra bet on Pinterest's future, and he was right. If Pinterest had failed, that 8% would be worthless. Holding equity requires conviction and patience. Sciarra had both. Fourth, let's talk about identity. If you're a founder, your company can become your identity. When Sciarra left Pinterest, he didn't just leave a job, he left a piece of himself. And for years, he was defined by that departure. But Sciarra rebuilt. He found Joby Aviation. He became an executive chairman in a completely different industry. He proved that life after an early exit is possible, even if the shadow of what could have been never fully disappears. Is Paul Sciarra successful? Absolutely. He co-founded one of the most influential social media platforms of the 2010s. He made hundreds of millions of dollars. He's now leading a company trying to revolutionize transportation. By any measure, he's accomplished extraordinary things. But in the startup world, success is relative. And when your former co-founders are billionaires, $700 million can still feel like losing. If stories like this, where we uncover the economic events that shaped our world while most people weren't paying attention, fascinate you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, because we're just getting started with these financial educational mysteries.